Today we're joined by author and podcast author Randal Schwartz, who's written several books on the Perl programming language and is a host of FLOSS Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us today, Randal.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This should be cool. Well, I hope it's cool. It's actually very warm, but that's not the same as cool. But it'll be cool in content. There we go.
Well, where are you right now?
I am in Portland, Oregon, actually a small suburb of it called Beaverton, Oregon. I've lived around this area all my life, and I don't plan on ever moving, even though I spend most of my time either on cruise ships or down in Southern California where my primary clients are. But yeah, and I just got back from Porto Alegre, Brazil, which I was hosting a conference, and I was presenting at a conference. Spoke about the Dart programming language and about what's the other thing? Oh, my 50 years, half my life with Perl. So 25 years. Perl turned a couple years ago, and I turned 50 same year. So I thought, hey, I'll do a talk about it, and I relabeled the talk "My Half Life with Perl" because I thought it was more fun.
So you've moved from Perl to Dart. Is that your new programming language of choice?
Well, I mean, I've got a client that's willing to pay me to do it, and Dart reminds me a lot of Smalltalk. I was doing Smalltalk back in 1982, so of course when Perl finally got objects, that was really nice because then I could go ahead and do real object-oriented programming and stuff. And so, and Perl 6, of course, is all objects, so it's going to be even more fun to play with. But Dart is also objects from top down, and it has a lot of feeling of a modern language. They got cascades right, which was nice. Cascades are always backwards in Smalltalk, where you had to say yourself a lot of times in the end of the chain. And the dot operator in Dart is actually correct. They got it right the second time around.
You know, it's funny. I hear a lot of references to Smalltalk and Smalltalk 80, for example, as being a very technically correct language. And a lot of people sort of reference historically and why didn't it take off. What in your mind actually prevents a technology that is superior from being adopted, and why do inferior solutions actually supplant them?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Let's see if I can give you any kind of answer for that. One of the problems with Smalltalk is that it was $1,000 or $10,000 a seat, and that was way too expensive. Nobody could afford it at that rate, and so there were a couple of like open source Smalltalks that came out, but they didn't have any traction, so it was it just sucked. I'm really hoping Dart now, because it's got Google behind it, and Google's actually using it for internal projects, that it really is going to be a very solid language to be programming in. And I'm sort of in at the ground floor. It's about the same point where I got really involved with Perl. Is about where Dart is right now. So that tells me a lot. If I can start writing courses and books and trainings, things like that, all around Dart, and that's why I started by doing this 1-hour talk down in Porto Alegre, then I can get on the ground floor and build up a training company again. You know, Perl training is pretty much dead, so I need to find something else that I can use to make a reasonable income until I'm well into my retirement age.
So you have a very long history in this, Randal, and most of our listeners probably know you through FLOSS Weekly, but I kind of want to ask, so can you tell us a little more about your career background before the show, how you first encountered programming, and how you came to host a podcast from there?
Well, that's interesting. It's exactly the talk of, or the content of the talk that I gave in there, so it's all really fresh in my mind. The biggest thing is that my dad had a really strong work ethic, and he said, son, you're going to have to go make yourself a living at some point here. And so I looked around, I realized I kind of liked math, and I kind of liked electronics, and I thought, well, computers are sort of the intersection of that. Now, this is computers back in 1976, where pretty much this was just before Pop Electronics had the Altair 8800 on the cover, but I built an MSI 8080 for the high school that I was at. So I knew that I wanted to be a programmer. I just knew that I wanted to do that. And then through a bunch of accidental career choices, I actually ended up being a technical writer as well as a programmer. And then from there, I migrated to teaching. So I started doing all these different things. I was just kind of like a Renaissance guy, a little bit of everything in the community. So I mean, there's a little piece of my code in every copy of Emacs Lisp. There's a little piece of my code in the Perl distribution, obviously. But I've been around so many different things that it's just been really a lot of fun. Never bored.
So what is it that you think actually makes for good technical content? So like it's really difficult for a lot of for programming concepts to be conveyed easily and simply. What is it that makes it accessible to someone who might not be aware of a concept? And what makes things accessible to people who might not be aware of how programming works in general?
Well, the trouble with answering that question is I learned programming long before I had any kind of meta-analysis about how I learned something. So I don't really, like even learning Perl, I say right in front, this is not to teach you programming. This is to teach you how to program in Perl, but I presume you already know what a subroutine is and what a subroutines and array. those are the two things that I think if you've got those two concepts down, the rest of everything can fill in almost every language. So, but I was trying to remember how I learned about how to do an array, and I couldn't think back to that far because I was back when I was 9. That's a long time ago. So I have no idea how to teach that. And same thing with subroutine. I can kind of teach subroutines, but I think it's much better to already have an array figured out. Why would you need one? Why would you want an index? Why would you want indirect variables like that? That doesn't make any sense unless you actually finally get into it. Another thing that's very important, I think, in the tutorial books and the tutorial, the articles I've written, is that I'm very careful about what to leave out. I actually think of training and teaching and articles that I've written. Want to end up at the other point at the other end, and so I try to take the smallest number of moves it takes to get from one end to the other. And I think too many people ruin a good tutorial by packing everything in like it's a reference. And I think that's probably why my books have been successful and really approachable.
And Randal, you were saying you kind of began programming, especially in Perl, about 25 years ago, kind of at the birth of the open source movement. But I'm curious, when you were young and kind of picking this up, would you say you kind of had open source instincts? Was there any kind of like proto-open source thing going on in the community, or basically just with how you approached it?
Well, back in those days, we called it shareware. It wasn't anything like open source. Although, once I got to see the source code of Unix v6, and I went, well, this is really incredible that I can study every little aspect of this thing. And then I heard about the GNU movement and the Free Software Foundation, and that got me a lot more interested. And so, you know, having access to all these open source tools really helped my education process. And now it's sort of a given that everybody's going to do something in open source, and proprietary seems to be the exception rather than the rule these days, which is I'm really appreciative of. So it's very nice.
So it really helped you personally to learn because you could actually study the source code. But what do you think the impact that open source has on society as a whole, though?
I think the fact that you don't have vendor lock-in in terms of people being able to help you out. So in other words, if I buy Microsoft products, then I have to go to Microsoft to get bugs fixed and to get more training and education, although there's some third-party stuff for that. But really, I'm locked into whatever the features are that it ships with. Whereas with open source software, particularly in translations, there's not a lot of people that translate to Brazilian Portuguese. And so now by having open source, they can take all this code and translate it so that native users can use it in their language of their choice. You know, most technology people speak English, thank God, because that's otherwise my 5-day conference would have been really boring. But no, I think that's really important. I think it's important to have, you know, not have vendor lock-in in terms of having software. Plus, you get to leverage your user base. So, like on code that if I released it as proprietary code, then I have to hire all the programmers I need to make it better and better. Whereas with open source, other people can contribute back to me. And a lot of the projects we've had on FLOSS Weekly, we do have that sort of sharing going back and forth. I'm a little more concerned about the projects where the end users probably aren't also programmers, so they get a lot less contribution. But I've even talked about, well, if you can't contribute code, maybe you can contribute use cases or places where you'd like another feature, and that's great because the actual people building the software then can get more guidance about how it'd be more useful for other people. So you don't have to code. There's probably a dozen different ways that you can contribute to open source without even picking up a line of programming.
You know, it's amazing to see how widely the open source ethos can be applied, and we've seen that in a lot of projects we've had on the show that have been not just purely technical in nature. But my question for you, I guess, would be, what was the inciting moment when you kind of went from focusing mainly on technical writing to also starting FLOSS Weekly? And for those who have not listened to the show, can you explain what FLOSS is and how it's different from dentistry?
Okay, yeah, I didn't create the show. I took it over at episode 17. Originally, it was Chris DeBona and Leo Laporte, and I was brought on as a guest on episode 9, talking about Perl, obviously, and also other things in my history. But then it went through pod fade. Chris DeBona had a baby. Well, his wife had the baby. I think he's got involved, though, somehow. And there was like no more shows. And I was actually on Leo Laporte's TV show, who was doing out of Canada. And I said, what happened to FLOSS Weekly? And he said, well, why don't you bring me some guests? And I said, oh, okay, and then I can co-host? He goes, yeah. So I did that for about 2 or 3 years, and then turns out that Leo wanted to move on and do some other shows because he saw it was in good hands, so I became the full show runner. So I decide the topics. I solicit for people to be on the show. which I do every week. I beg for more guests because it always makes my work a little bit easier. But that was also a breakthrough. About 3 years into my show running, I just started crowdsourcing who's on the show. And I have discovered so many amazing different projects because of this that I would never have gotten to. And I read tons of blogs, I read open source, documentation and stuff, but I would never have gotten the variety of stuff that my crowd has actually brought me. So I really appreciate that for them.
So is there any projects that specifically maybe you've found support because of your listeners? I mean, obviously your podcast itself has benefited from you crowdsourcing these things. But are there programming efforts or projects that have benefited from that?
Yes, we get a bunch of bumps, except for the really big established projects. But like SaltStack said, we put them on the map, which is really cool because they were just a fledgling little group and maybe had 20 developers or something. And all of a sudden, my show, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm guessing the downloads are somewhere between 20 and 50,000 a week. And that's counting all audio and video and everything like that. And that's a significant bump, especially for a small project. So yeah, in fact, they often say things like, we slash-dotted, if you remember that old term, their website sometimes. It's like, hey, oh no, look, they're all coming to see it. Well, I think that's the kind of problem you want to have.
So for you, what have been the most interesting projects you featured on the show, the most compelling, and just the most fascinating?
Wow. Oh, boy, how did you do that in 430 episodes? Let's see. Well, Dart got me started being aware of Dart, and we're actually doing a follow-up to it in about three or four more weeks because there's been a lot of progress in the last couple of years. But yeah, I wouldn't have known about Dart until somebody suggested that as one of my projects. There was a lot of cloudy cloud stuff for a while there. We were doing, we had the Red Hat community coordinator was actually bringing me projects. Of course, they're all cloud related. So people kept saying, "Are you going to have another show about cloud? I mean, why do you keep doing this?" I go, "Well, there's so many different things. There's overt and all. Anyway, it's too hard to remember everything, but." Yeah, so it's luckily we kind of went through that phase, and we don't have anything like that anymore. But and having BitPay on was pretty amazing, so that was kind of fun. I guess that'd be relevant for this show. Boy, I just trying to remember. I think the heat is affecting my brain. Well, anyway, yeah, no, it's just been fascinating, and I always try to make sure that it's not a news show. It's more of a magazine format, which means that I want there to be this huge back catalog of content that people can go back and pick up, as an introduction to that. So I've rarely had the same project on twice because, things move a little bit, but they don't move that much necessarily. So I'm pretty hesitant when somebody says, you went for version 1.3, and now we're up to version 1.6. Can we do it again? I said, no, there's plenty of other people ahead of line for you. So you just go back and listen to the old show. And although they're not in the RSS feed, they are all the way back to episode 1 directly on the Twit website. So you can dial in any number you want all the way back to number 1. So a quick little curl command can actually download them all. So.
That's fantastic. We distribute our show on BitTorrent, for example, and we're about to start publishing a sort of an anthology where you can just download everything as a single torrent because we encourage free distribution.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what do you think is one of the biggest opportunities for open source? What is the most important areas where open source needs to be applied today? And this can be outside of software if you think that that's appropriate.
Well, I'm not part of it, but I'm really liking the open hardware movements, the makers and things like that. I think there's a lot of stuff going on there. Aaron Newcomb, one of my co-hosts, is really into that, and I believe Guillermo is also big into the maker movement. And I don't have time to play with hardware because, for one thing, I'd have to carry it on every flight that I'm on. It's because I'm only in Portland maybe 3 days a month, so I can't have stuff here, and I can't have stuff in hotels down there, so I'm pretty much limited to whatever I can carry on my laptop.
So Randal, I guess a broader question related to Eric's might be, do you think open source is kind of on the rise? I mean, we've obviously had an open source movement for about 25 years, but so much of kind of just the architecture of what we use now is based on some degree of open source software, whether it's kind of Android or maybe servers using Linux. Do you think we've kind of hit a point where it's become more common, or do you think it still has ways to go to become really embraced by the public?
I don't think there's any question anymore about whether it's okay to open the source up for your codes. I think we've had enough successful projects demonstrate that open source brings more benefits than it would cost. Now, there might be some pointy-ear bosses out there that still don't agree with that, but I think we're mainstream. I mean, now, like I said, it's now unusual when somebody says, I'm going to release some proprietary software here. Because they have to go, what? That means we have to hire all the people that are ever going to fix this, and we won't get user contributions and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's just silly when people say, let's choose a proprietary solution now. I am a bit biased, obviously, because I live in the ecosystem where open source is the main thing. But I'm still, you know, I get yelled at for running an iOS phone and my Mac laptop, but at the end of the day, it gets my job done, and a lot of the software that's on my laptop is all open source. So I'm pretty happy with that as well. So I compile GNU Emacs every morning just to make sure it still works on a Mac. I compile Git every morning to make sure it still works on a Mac. So I'm kind of like the canary in the coal mine for those things. Again, another way you can contribute without actually writing any source code. All I do is wait until it breaks, and if it breaks, I just submit a bug report. I don't even fix the source code there. I don't care. I don't know that. My C skills are rusty again, so I'm not doing much that way. But and I compile Perl 6 every morning just to make sure that it's moving forward too. So I have this little tmux script that goes and starts with like 8 windows of download and downloads all the source code and then starts compiling it. So it's really fun to bounce from one window to the other as different things get built.
That's really cool. Does your sort of open source philosophy in running as much open source software as you can, does that run all the way down to, say, the BIOS, or I guess it's replaced by something more secure UEFI now?
I'm actually not a card-carrying member of the Free Software Foundation. I think it's perfectly okay to run whatever you want to run, whatever gets your work done at the end of the day. I actually prefer the BSD-style licenses because I think they give more freedom to the people that are downstream. The thing about the GPL is that the original author has more rights than every other author after that. And I think that's unbalanced. But some people disagree, but that's me and them disagreeing. So, yeah, I prefer BSD-style licenses. That's me. Well,
let me get you to expand on licenses for a second. So, first of all, our audience may not be explicitly aware of, GPL versus BSD, but we'll include some links to both licenses in our show description. What are your thoughts on an MIT license?
I consider the permissive licenses like MIT, Apache, BSD style, all the variants on that. I consider all those to be permissive licenses, and that's as opposed to, say, the GPL and the LGPL family and stuff. I consider those to be very restrictive licenses. And so, yeah, I don't have any problem with MIT license, and Perl's artistic license is very similar to that too. So I'm very happy with that. I think it allows for the ultimate freedom. It allows for you to get your code in more places than giving it under the GPL would. I really believe that.
So, Randal, what do you see as being some of the most common shared features you've seen in all the projects you've had on the show that have been most successful? So what really makes a good successful open source project? Obviously, we have kind of the foundational stuff like releasing the source code and involving the community. But of the most successful ones you've seen, what have been the most standout features?
The biggest thing, I think, is making sure that you embrace the community. Your bug tracker should be public. Your GitHub or whatever you're doing your source code in should be public. But Simon Phipps taught me this over and over again, is that your governance also has to be public. In other words, you can't have the company just open source its project and take no input about what the roadmap's going to look like. So there has to be a third party. There has to be a governance committee that's not just people in the company. And I think a lot of people don't get that right. But if they get it right, I think it has legs on its own. It's like if you look at all the projects that Oracle ruined when they bought Sun. Everything had to ultimately fork. We had Hudson became Jenkins. What are some of the other ones? MySQL became Maria. The only one they haven't ruined yet, I think it's because they don't know they have it, is VirtualBox. They renamed it Oracle VirtualBox, but they haven't ruined the project yet. I don't know how that one's actually made it through. So, don't tell anybody, okay? I don't think Oracle knows they own it.
Well, that's really interesting. So have you ever, some of the guests that you've had on, have you ever gone off to contribute to those open source projects?
Not as often as I'd like. My schedule is really crazy busy with all my travels and all the, I still have, day job clients that I have to take care of, and I try to get anything I'm doing though to be open sourceable. So yes, I have sort of contributed back to Perl from time to time with CPAN stuff. I I think I've helped out with Salt a little bit there too, and I'm definitely being very active in the Dart community. So I'll probably end up writing some code. Their equivalent of the CPAN is called the Pub. They try to stay in this whole, the whole pub theme, darts and pub and all the other things like that. So that's their theme, which I can't disagree with. So that's good.
Now, you've had a number of open source as well as decentralized technology projects on your show over the past few years, and obviously you've had Copay on the show, you've had one of our co-hosts, Tony Sakich's project, Augur, on the show. And my question for you, I guess, you've been in the open source software movement. We're sort of the decentralization movement, as the name implies. Do you see a connection between decentralization and technology and open sourcing?
Not immediately, except of course for it to be decentralized, it'd have to be open source. I mean, that would just be an absolute mandate, because how are you going to have a decentralized system when you have to get the binaries from somebody proprietary? That's weird.
And what are your thoughts kind of on the projects you've seen that have been decentralized? Do you think that's a promising direction for technology to take, or do you think it's kind of a more immediate localized to Bitcoin?
Well, I was actually sort of amazed by the Augur show. I didn't really understand it, and it looked like it was going to be buzzword bingo worthy. Then all we'd hearing is keywords the entire time. But the interview actually went really well, and I finally understood what it was all about. And I'm sure there's some people that were my listeners that had that same sort of aha moment about how this is done. How do we have polling where it makes sense for people to be able to put a question out there, and how do we have this decentralized verification that the results are actually accurate? Both of those problems are solved with this. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, I like that. And I'm not much into Bitcoin. I still have 0.05 Bitcoins that I got for free many years ago. And I think it's like, what, $100 now or something? No, $30, somewhere in there. Probably depending on what day it is. But I haven't done any more with that. So I'll probably start playing some more with it now that I've been on these projects.
Well, let me go ahead and ask you a little bit more about the Bitcoin question and tie it back to an earlier thing that you said about successful open source projects. The biggest point of discussion lately is in the governance of Bitcoin. There is no company behind Bitcoin. There's not even really a team that's responsible for it. It's open source software, and it's in fact encouraged that people modify it and go do things with it. What is your read on the model that Bitcoin has taken, as opposed to, say, the model that Node.js or Dart, or even more specifically the Linux model, where Linus is sort of like the authority figure there? What's your read on that?
It's interesting. I can't imagine though how, where are you going to get the roadmap, or does it really matter? I mean, could you ever fork the code and have it do different things, or are you always going to have to respect, specification 1.0, which is the only specification right now? You always have to respect that if you're releasing, blockchain-related materials. And I'm glad that the original developer had the sense of putting the code in there to do the sidechain stuff, because it would be impossible to add it now. Because we can't fork the specification at this point anymore. So it's unless there's some backward compatibility thing, but I don't even imagine how that would work. Yeah, I guess I haven't thought too much about it, but yeah, I don't know. Bitcoin seems pretty successful, so it's not consumer successful yet, but that's okay, because a lot of open source software isn't consumer successful. People may be using Google every day, not realizing that's all Linux computers instead of Windows, because they wouldn't know the difference, and they don't care as long as they get Google search results and up comes their cat pictures. They're fine.
So Randal, as you said, Floss has had over 400 episodes now. You're going strong.
Yeah.
I'm very curious, and as a podcaster who's been doing this only for about 30 episodes, we're at episode 39 right now. How do you maintain that steady schedule of producing? What does your schedule look like? How do you sort of get your guests and your co-hosts every week? How do you find a way to make that consistent production?
Well, I spend about 4 hours a week, I think, in terms of calculation, but that also includes the actual hour and a half of taping live. But no, behind the scenes, I have to manage the schedule. We have a Google spreadsheet where when somebody wants to be on the show, I say, well, go add yourself. Go figure out what date you want. It's got a question mark in the first column. Pick that. And then about every 2 months, I roll forward another quarter of dates so that I can get that all. I'd have to tag out the times when I can't host, And so before I open those shows up, I need to make sure that I have at least one of my other rotating panel co-hosts can migrate to being the host for that show. So then I can open those up. So I'm about to do this for Q4, and I'm going to miss at least, I think, 4 shows in Q4. So again, I can't open those shows until somebody else like Aaron Newcomb or Simon Phipps come along and do that. So the spreadsheet, the public side of the spreadsheet has just the project name and the hosts. I have a private side to that same spreadsheet, which I figured out how to do in Google Spreadsheet, which is really cool, where I have like the contact email, whether I've got the rundown brought back yet, what the state of that is. And now I have a new column for sponsors. So that way, if somebody wants to opt out of being reading the code for a particular sponsor, they can let me know ahead of time, and so I'll make sure to mark them out. Oh yeah, and one more column that has like no GA, yes DL. So Dan Lynch can do that show, but Guillermo Amaral can't. And so I just have to keep going forward and looking at it. And about every few days, I get a tickler item on my to-do list that says, "Go move FLOSS Weekly forward a little bit. There's got to be something you do. Just ask for new guests or something." So, yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's also helped me be a lot more famous. I was worrying about what after Perl. And it used to be I'd go to a conference like OSCON, and people go by, "Love your Perl books, love your Perl books, love your Perl columns." But then that started fading out a little bit after about, I think about the late 90s, early 2000s. And I said, what am I going to do next? What can I be an expert on again? And then I just happened to bump into Leo Laporte, took on this podcast. And now when I go to conference, even Perl conferences, people come up to me and go, "Love your podcast, love your podcast." So I have made successfully the transition from one way of being famous to another way of being even more famous. So I'm going to keep doing this show for as long as they let me.
So would you say that the reason that you've done this is certainly for personal interests, but would you say that that podcasting and passion-driven projects can actually help you acquire more work? Is that something that you've found?
Yeah, I've figured out that if I'm famous, more people like me. And so more people like me, they're more likely to hire me. I know the last 4 companies, the last 4 long-term clients, what I've been there for longer than 6 months or a year, have all said, "We all listen to your podcast. We really appreciate it. Well, yeah, and this is a Perl shop, so we know you from there." But really, it's about the podcast. It's about me bringing that. And I often, like when I'm taping at ZipRecruiter, I'll say I'm here at ZipRecruiter, so that they can get their name out there as sort of a low-level advertising too. But yeah, so it has been significant. It's definitely been significant for getting me gigs, and also all the privilege of getting to speak with all these big projects all around the world. Linus Torvalds and I play pool together here in Portland. And I met him because I wanted him on the show, and so got there. Same thing with Monty. Getting Monty Wadenius talking about Maria and getting that all up to date. So I've gotten to talk to some of the big, as I say in every show, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, and the little projects you might not have heard about. So I really make sure I want to cover all that whole broad base of anybody I can, and it's a privilege. And it's a lot more fun, and I'm getting a lot better at it too. So over the years, my interviewing style has gotten very honed in.
So as you mentioned earlier in the show, you're in a very hot climb. So we're going to ask you 1 or 2 more questions and then let you go, so you can get in some cooler temperatures.
Yeah.
But
I may just go take a cold shower too. We'll see. It's getting really crazy here. Yeah. Go ahead.
So what do you think is the future of podcasting as a medium?
You cut out there. I didn't hear that. Sorry.
I'm curious, but what are your thoughts on the future of podcasting as kind of a medium for communication? I mean, it's been out there for a few years now. Some people have done really well in it. There are kind of a lot of podcasts out there. But do you think we've hit peak podcast, or do you think it still has a lot to offer?
I think as more and more people discover how to subscribe to podcasts, and also how simple it is to produce them. I mean, there's a lot of work involved, but there's not a lot of technology involved. I mean, here we are using Google Hangouts. We didn't have that 3 years ago. And so now we can have this global conversation where we get videos automatically switched for us, we get audio merged together, and it's a game changer for that. Anybody can be doing podcasts, anybody can be doing YouTube videos to talk about doing their trainings and stuff, and now you've got YouTube subscribe channels, things like that. I think it's just going to keep getting more and more like that, and especially as we get more and more connectivity, where we're getting faster and faster stuff on our mobile apps. I think that's going to keep changing it too. So I don't think we're anywhere near peak podcasting. There's already too many out there for me to subscribe to. So I don't think I'm ever going to be bored. It's like, Randal, why don't you read audiobooks? I go, I don't need audiobooks. I have so much podcasting backlog that I can't even touch them.
All right, Randall, as we're wrapping up the show, why don't you go ahead and share some where the people can find you on the web, social media, URLs, where can people get connected with Floss and some of your other projects?
Okay, well, the twit.tv/floss is the homepage for the podcast, and there you'll find links to my email address, merlin@stonehenge.com, in case you want to suggest possible projects or get them to suggest possible projects for me. I'm also Randal L. Schwartz on Google+. I am Merlin on Twitter, and let's see, where else am I? I'm all over the net, actually. There's a Wikipedia page about me that lists most of this, so just go there. That'll be fine. Or www.stonehenge.com/Merlin, with a Y, Merlyn. That's my personal homepage, but it's woefully out of date. You know, the shoemaker's children problem. I don't have any time to keep my own website up to date, so I just blog a lot, and it seems to work out pretty well.
All right. Well, Randall, again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Yes, hopefully before I melt, we can get going here. Thanks.
Yep.